Good morning, everybody. I feel like I always tell people I'm from Berkeley, but I believe in the free market. It's a little bit like saying Portland, Maine and Portland, Oregon. It's kind of, where are you from? What are you about? Anyway, I want to talk a little bit about general principles of the relationship between transit and real estate markets. I'm not going to be presenting any specific market data here, but this is really to sort of set the frame for a lot of the rest of the discussion that happens today, and then what Bill and Al will be talking about tomorrow. Whoops, of course I pushed the wrong button. Let's see. Yeah, got it. Okay, I should know by now. Okay, so first of all, when we look at transit-oriented districts, not just individual developments, but districts, we want to know what are the basic criteria that set up market readiness. How do we know that some place is going to be a currently strong marketplace, or how is the market demand going to evolve over time? So, of course, the basic fundamentals here are about demographics, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about demographic and employment trends, and I'm going to continue to reiterate the point that Bill made, he gently touched on before, but I'm going to push home about this link between jobs and housing. But the other thing is that, again, if you can't get on the train and go where you want to go, you're not going to ride the train, right? Or the bus, for that matter. So this connection between where I live and where I work is essential. And then also government planning and zoning are also essential. So I'm going to come back and talk about all of these things. So there are a lot of people who are my age who live in more suburban locations than I do who say nobody rides the train. And when they say nobody, they mean themselves. Because guess what? There are a lot of young people, and I just read over the weekend that the millennial generation that's defined basically from people who are born from about 1980 to about 2000, that millennial generation has now surpassed the baby boomers in absolute numbers. Not by a lot, but it has surpassed the baby boomers. Some of that is because the boomers are starting to die off, but also there's a lot of in-migration still in that younger generation. Okay, so these millennials, these younger people are showing a strong propensity to drive less. And as Bill said, they would rather be looking at Facebook, or my personal favorite, Twitter, than driving. And so they really value transit, and this is becoming a huge issue for economic competitiveness around the country. But the other thing that's interesting about the baby boomers, my generation, is that unlike the generation ahead of us, fewer of us are interested in retiring to golf communities in Arizona, and many more of us are interested in retiring to places like downtown San Diego. So in these two demographic slices, the millennials and the baby boomers, we are seeing a very steep decline in interest in driving and more of an interest in urban living. And as you see from this chart, these are both important components of the San Diego region's population. So you're getting a lot of millennials, and you have a lot of knowledge-based industries that you're trying to drive, so this is the talent also. And for now, some of your big employers say that you haven't had trouble recruiting talent because of congestion, but I would argue that over the next 5 to 10 years, I'm betting that that situation will change, and particularly as some of the other regions with which San Diego competes for economic development, economic recruitment, start to also really build out their transit lines like Salt Lake, your employers will be rethinking some of this. So also businesses, as I said, are increasingly choosing locations based on lifestyle and amenities. As Bill said, warehouse and distribution businesses need to be near highways. That's what really drives their business, is access and getting goods, moving goods in and out. But many of these knowledge-based industries are really interested in moving people in and out and how to get people. So in looking at where I don't know if there's a pointer on this. Okay, I'm gonna do without the pointer, but I'm hoping you can read, but these two biggest bars in the middle here are knowledge-based industries. Those are professional, technical, and scientific related businesses, software engineering, architectural and engineering services. All of those kinds of businesses are tending to cluster and locate around transit at a greater percentage than if there is transit than in the region as a whole. So those are transit-oriented industries. Now, the other reason that employment becomes really important in this discussion about transit-oriented development is because even though the work trip represents only about 20% of the total trips that we take in the course of a day, transit commuters represent 60% of transit ridership. So if you want to have a successful transit system and you want to have people not complain about the fact that the train never goes where I want to go, you better connect that transit line up to those employment centers. This is really essential. And the interesting story for here in San Diego is that many of your strongest employment centers in this region are not yet served by transit, but they will be. This is in the 2050 plan that Colleen went over. The way your system is currently set up now, it's what we call hub and spoke. Everything kind of feeds into downtown San Diego. But it's interesting to note that only 18% of your employment is actually in downtown San Diego, and that 75% of your region's office-based employment, which is also what we consider transit-oriented employment, is in the northern part of the county. So this is why we really need to focus on those connections, and we need to be able to get people from the south part of the county to the north part of the county, not just to downtown. So this is really going to be a big part of market readiness. Now, market strength and understanding market strength is also critical for implementing transit-oriented development, because development feasibility is tied to how much money I can charge for the unit, either for the rent or the sales price. Construction prices can be pretty consistent around the region, but what makes the difference on feasibility is how much money I can get for that unit. So I can have the same unit in two different locations and have hundreds of dollars, in some cases even $1,000 less in value for the exact same product type, and that's all dictated by location. So amenities, all kinds of things can help to overcome some of that price differential, but we have to recognize that markets play a strong role in feasibility. Now, as Susan I said earlier, feasibility and the rate at which TOD was being produced in this region over the last 5 years or so was very strongly influenced by the recession, and now we're starting to see development activity coming back. But this may surprise some of you. This market has already responded to transit. And research shows, and these are by academics, these are not by real estate rosy-colored glass-type people, that in the San Diego condominiums command a 16% price premium if they're within that half-mile radius to transit. And by the way, we've done this work for BART in the Bay Area, and we got exactly the same result. It's about 15%. People will pay 15% more for a condo if it's within the half mile of transit. And that's really an essential thing to keep in mind if we're trying to make that higher density product feasible. But this also plays out with the single family units. It's about 6% price premium for single family units. So home buyers value transit. And the interesting thing about these numbers is these people in surveys indicate that they are not always riding the transit, but as Bill said earlier, they like to have the choice. They like to know it's there. They like to have that option, and they're going to pay more to have that choice. But what we often see is that there's a mismatch between local land use policy and development feasibility. And this can go in two different ways. In some places where people are not willing to pay a lot of money for a unit, but the community really wants high density, communities tend to overzone. In some cases, there are high-value communities, and you all know who they are in this region, that are fighting density. They don't want more density, even though the density would be feasible there. The other thing is that parking, for example, plays a huge role in the feasibility of buildings. It costs between $30,000 and $40,000 to build a structured parking space. And if you can build fewer parking spaces and have more leasable area going to the housing, you can make projects more feasible. So again, really understanding this relationship between your local zoning regulations that may push for too much parking, that may push for too much height, not enough height, not the right kind of building type. This is a huge impact on feasibility. And again, it goes both ways. Overzoning, underzoning, too much parking, not enough parking, how you balance all those things. And this is complicated because it's a bit of a moving target and it's very specific to location. Now, the other thing about land use context is that it doesn't always work out the way we expected. So this is a map of Charlotte, North Carolina. It's at the south part of North Carolina, so I always have to think. And if you can see, there are a lot of tiny gray dots on here. And this shows, this is the blue line in Charlotte. It opened in 2005, 2006, and there was immediately a huge pop in development. And where was all that development? It was close into the employment center of downtown. So that employment proximity created a huge amount of value. We did the same kind of analysis for other transit corridors around the country, and in all cases we saw the same thing. The first low-hanging fruit for development is really the development that is closest to those employment areas. So this is why this connectivity between transit and employment is also very important. It really helps to set the stage for market readiness. So what we saw here is that the downtown area that had the least amount of land area, so only 10% of that land area was available for redevelopment, but it got 2/3 of the actual development activity. And then some of these suburban locations that had a huge amount of land capacity got just minimal amounts of development. Now, as my colleagues pointed out to me yesterday, this was only in the first few years after the transit line opened, and that's true. We do see that transit, or that building out around transit infrastructure takes a long period of time. It's not going to happen in 5 years, but we need to really think about these station areas that have a lot of capacity but less market demand, and how are we going to really think about those places. But in the meantime, we have to recognize that if we really want to think about how to facilitate the market, we have to always think about the jobs housing connection. So just in concluding, I'm going to reiterate my points and underscore them because they're really important. Future transit investments have to link up to major employment centers, and this can really help with the growth and mitigating transit congestion. And this is not about creating new employment centers. Most regions have a lot of capacity in their existing transit employment centers. So we don't want to think about scattering jobs all over the region. Actually, the employment centers benefit from the concentration or the agglomeration. So we really want to continue to focus on building up the employment centers that we have, connecting to them, and then building value over time. We also have to remember that this is not a linear process. The TOD is going to evolve over time, and there'll be fits and starts, stops and starts. There are places now in the Bay Area that are getting development that we never would have imagined 20 years ago would get this kind of development. So some of these projects are a long, slow slog. I think local governments have a huge role, but I think local governments have been accustomed to being in a reactive position. You set up your zoning, and you sit back and you wait. And I think now local government has to be much more flexible, much more nimble, and much more strategic in order to think about how to be able to right-size and calibrate your policies in a way that are going to facilitate your vision. And then really think about how market plays into the specific barriers that you're confronting at your particular location, because we can all talk about these big, broad lessons, and there are always going to be exceptions. So know your context, understand your market, and then think backwards from there. Thank you very much.